The crisp morning air nipped at his face as he pulled into the empty high school parking lot. The clock on his dashboard read 5:45 a.m., perfect timing to watch the sunrise while warming up. He'd been following this routine for years, long before anyone knew his name or cared about his dreams of reaching the Olympics. This wasn't just any track for him. Every crack in the pavement, every worn lane marking told a story. 10 years ago, he'd been just another freshman trying to figure out where he belonged. Now, at 24, he was one of the country's top sprinters, with sponsorship deals and magazine features to his name. But something about this old-school track kept pulling him back. He stepped out of his car, his training bag slung over his shoulder, and took a deep breath. The familiar scent of morning dew on grass filled his lungs. The massive oak trees that lined the track cast long shadows in the early morning light, their leaves rustling gently in the spring breeze. This was his sanctuary, the place where he'd first discovered his gift for running. As he walked toward the track, memories flooded back. He remembered his first coach, an old-school teacher who saw something special in the quiet kid who always stayed late after practice. "You've got lightning in those legs," the coach used to say, "but it's the thunder in your heart that'll take you places." Those words had carried him through countless early mornings like this one, through injuries and setbacks, through victories and defeats. He started his warm-up routine, each movement practiced and purposeful. The rubber track surface felt soft and springy under his feet as he began his light jog. His breath created small clouds in the cool morning air, and the only sounds were his footfalls and the occasional chirp of early birds. The rising sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange, casting a golden glow across the football field. He remembered how this track looked under Friday night lights, packed with cheering crowds during state championships. Now, in the peaceful morning solitude, it felt like an entirely different world. His phone buzzed, a text from his current coach reminding him about their afternoon session. The Olympic trials were just months away, and every training minute counted. But these morning sessions, these were just for him. No stopwatch, no pressure, just the pure joy of running that had captured his heart as a teenager. He picked up his pace, feeling the familiar burn in his muscles. The track had been recently resurfaced, but he could still point to the exact spot where he'd won his first race, where he'd broken the school record, where he'd fallen and gotten back up countless times. Each lap was like turning a page in his personal history book. The school's maintenance worker arrived, giving him a friendly wave. They'd developed an unspoken routine over the years. The worker would unlock the gates early, knowing the young athlete would leave everything exactly as he found it. Sometimes they'd share a thermos of coffee and talk about life, sports, and dreams. As the sun climbed higher, he moved into his sprint drills. His shoes gripped the track perfectly as he exploded forward, his movements fluid and powerful. A few early morning dog walkers stopped to watch from behind the fence. He'd gotten used to the attention, but it still felt surreal sometimes, this transformation from a kid with big dreams to someone others looked up to. He paused to take a drink from his water bottle, watching as the school's lights began flickering on one by one. The campus would soon be bustling with weekend activities, band practice, debate team meetings, other athletes training. But for now, in this peaceful morning moment, the track was his alone. His watch beeped, 7:00 a.m. He'd been here over an hour already, but time always seemed to fly on this track. As he started his cool-down routine, he noticed a few cars beginning to pull into the nearby streets. The neighborhood was waking up, and soon this quiet moment would end. But he'd be back tomorrow, just like always, chasing his dreams in the place where they first took shape. Little did he know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine, and his regular training session would spark a chain of events that would change not just his life, but his entire community. The peaceful sunrise session was about to take an unexpected turn that would test his character in ways no athletic competition ever had. He went through his final stretches, completely unaware that eyes were watching him from a nearby window and that someone was already reaching for their phone to make a call that would turn this serene morning into something entirely different. The morning's peace shattered with the sound of an angry voice cutting through the air. A woman in designer athleisure wear came marching across the street, her phone clutched tightly to her ear. She'd moved into the neighborhood just 3 weeks ago, and like many newcomers, she'd joined the local community watch group before even unpacking all her boxes. "Yes, I'm reporting suspicious activity at the high school," she spoke into her phone, her voice carrying across the track. "There's someone who doesn't belong here." She emphasized the last words while glaring at the athlete who had stopped his cool-down routine and was now standing still, trying to process the situation. The athlete raised his hand in a friendly wave, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Good morning," he called out, his voice steady and calm despite the knot forming in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this from friends, but experiencing it firsthand felt surreal. "I'm just finishing up my morning training." The woman didn't wave back. Instead, she moved closer to the fence, her phone still pressed to her ear. "He's still here," she continued speaking to the dispatcher. "I can see him clearly. He's wearing a gray hoodie and black running shorts." She began listing off details about his appearance as if she were reporting a crime in progress. Taking a deep breath, the athlete reached for his gym bag, pulling out his water bottle. Years of public speaking and community work had taught him how to handle tense situations. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I train here every morning. I'm a professional athlete preparing for the Olympic trials." But his words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. The woman had positioned herself near the track entrance, effectively blocking his path to the parking lot. "The school is closed," she announced, her voice sharp. "You need to leave immediately, or the police will remove you." A small crowd of morning joggers had started to gather at a distance, phones out, witnessing the scene unfold. The athlete noticed them but kept his attention focused on staying calm. He'd worked too hard, come too far, to let this moment get the better of him. "I understand your concern," he said, maintaining his composure. "But I have permission to use these facilities. If you'd like, we can walk together to the maintenance office. They know me here." He gestured toward the school building, where the maintenance worker he'd greeted earlier was now watching the situation with concern. The woman's response was immediate and loud. "Don't tell me what to do. I live right there," she pointed to a house across the street, "and I've never seen you here before. This is a private school facility, and I'm on the neighborhood watch." The athlete felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same weight he carried since childhood when faced with such situations. But years of mentoring young athletes had taught him that how he handled this moment mattered. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every kid who'd ever felt out of place, every athlete who'd faced prejudice while pursuing their dreams. He slowly reached for his phone, careful to keep his movements visible and non-threatening. "I'd be happy to show you my ID," he offered, "or my social media profiles. I actually graduated from this school. There are probably still some records hanging on the walls inside with my name on them." The woman's face flushed red, but she stood her ground. "The police are on their way," she declared, as if announcing a victory. "They'll sort this out." She began pacing back and forth, never taking her eyes off him, all while narrating his every movement to the dispatcher on the phone. More neighbors had started to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood uncertainly on their front lawns, while others moved closer, phones recording. The athlete noticed a few familiar faces, people who'd watched him train here for years, beginning to approach with concerned expressions. The morning sun, now fully risen, felt impossibly hot on his skin. He could feel sweat rolling down his back, no longer just from his workout. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his coach wondering why he wasn't at their usual post-training check-in. But he didn't dare reach for it now, not with so many eyes watching his every move. The distant sound of sirens began to grow louder, and the athlete felt an odd sense of calm settle over him. He'd done nothing wrong, and he knew it. This track, these grounds, they were as much a part of his story as any chapter in his life. He stood tall, shoulders back, the way he did before every race, every competition. The woman's triumphant expression as the police cars approached told its own story, one of assumptions, prejudices, and missed opportunities for understanding. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this moment was about to take an unexpected turn. The sirens grew louder, and with them came a twist of fate that would transform this confrontation into something neither of them could have anticipated. Two police cars pulled into the school parking lot, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. The athlete stood perfectly still, hands visible, just as his father had taught him years ago. The morning sun cast long shadows across the track as the first officer stepped out of his vehicle, and a smile of recognition immediately spread across his face. "Well, look who it is," the officer called out, his voice warm and friendly. "I was wondering why we got called to the track this early." He adjusted his badge, which caught the morning light as he walked toward them. This wasn't just any officer, this was someone who had sat through countless youth outreach programs, watching this very athlete inspire rooms full of kids. The woman with the phone looked confused, her certainty faltering for the first time that morning. She watched as the officer completely ignored her frantic waves and walked straight to the athlete, extending his hand for a friendly shake. "Didn't expect to see you here today," the officer said, then checked his watch. "Though I probably should have known, you're always training at this hour, aren't you?" His partner, a younger officer, had also emerged from the second car and was trying hard to maintain his professional composure despite the obvious irony of the situation. The woman stepped forward, still clutching her phone. "Officer, I called about an unauthorized person," she began, but the older officer held up his hand politely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice kind but firm, "do you know who this is?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "This gentleman isn't just any athlete. He's our department's youth outreach coordinator. In fact, he's supposed to be speaking at my daughter's school next week about community building and chase your dreams." The younger officer couldn't help adding, "I was at his talk last month at the community center. The kids wouldn't stop talking about it for weeks." He pulled out his phone, showing a group photo from that very event, the athlete surrounded by smiling children, police officers, and community members. The morning breeze carried the sound of approaching footsteps. The school's maintenance worker had finally made his way over, keys jangling at his belt. "Everything okay here?" he asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already understood the situation. "Been watching this young man train here for years. Best role model these kids could ask for." More neighbors had gathered now, many of them recording the scene on their phones. But unlike the tense videos that too often circulated on social media, this one would tell a different story. The woman's face had transformed from righteous anger to dawning embarrassment as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The older officer took out his notepad, more for show than necessity. "So let me get this straight," he said, keeping his tone light. "We got called out here because someone was using the track for running?" A few chuckles rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. The athlete, still calm and composed, spoke up. "It's actually good that you're here," he said, addressing both the officers and the woman. "Maybe we can talk about how to better introduce new neighbors to our community. I'm sure lots of people don't know about the school's morning training policy." The younger officer nodded enthusiastically. "You know, we could add something about this to next week's community meeting. Turn this whole thing into something positive." He glanced at his partner, who was already noting down the suggestion. The woman had lowered her phone, finally ending her call with dispatch. She stood awkwardly, shifting her weight from foot to foot as the reality of the situation sank in. The person she had reported as suspicious was not only well known, but deeply respected in the community she had just joined. The morning sun was higher now, warming the cool air. A few early bird students had arrived for weekend activities, watching the scene unfold with curious expressions. The older officer noticed them and saw another teaching opportunity. "You know," he said, addressing the small crowd that had gathered, "this is actually a perfect example of why we always talk about communication and community building." He gestured to the athlete. "Would you mind sharing a few words about your work with the department? Might as well make this morning count for something." The athlete looked at his watch. His official training session would have to wait. But some lessons were more important than physical training. As he began to speak, even the woman who had called the police found herself drawing closer to listen. The story of what happened that morning would soon spread through the community, but not in the way anyone might have initially expected. It would become a tale not of conflict, but of connection, not of suspicion, but of understanding. And it was far from over, because sometimes the most important moments happen after the sirens fall silent and people finally begin to truly see each other. Just as the tension began to ease, a white news van pulled into the school parking lot, its satellite dish gleaming in the morning sun. The reporter who stepped out wasn't there by chance. She'd been scheduled to interview the athlete about his Olympic journey and community work. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more awkward. The camera operator quickly began setting up his equipment while the reporter, a local veteran of morning news, took in the scene before her. She recognized the athlete immediately. After all, she'd been following his story since his high school days. What she hadn't expected was to find him surrounded by police cars and a crowd of onlookers. "We're actually a bit early for our interview," the reporter called out, walking toward the group with her microphone in hand. "But it looks like we've stumbled onto an even better story." Her experienced eyes had already assessed the situation: the embarrassed woman, the amused police officers, the gathered neighbors with their phones out. The woman who had made the call stood frozen, her face cycling through various shades of red, as she recognized the reporter from her morning news shows. The same reporter whose feature story about the athlete she'd read over breakfast just an hour ago, before all this began. "Wait," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're the one from the article?" The Olympic hopeful who's been training local kids. She pulled out her phone again, but this time to frantically scroll through her morning newsfeed, where the athlete's smiling face looked back at her from the headline. The camera operator had started filming, capturing the moment of recognition in all its raw authenticity. The reporter, sensing a powerful story unfolding, stepped closer with her microphone. "Would you mind telling us what brought everyone here this morning?" she asked, looking between the woman and the athlete. The athlete glanced at the woman, offering her an understanding smile. "We just had a small misunderstanding about who belongs where," he said diplomatically. "But I think we're working it out." His voice carried no hint of anger or resentment, only a genuine desire to turn this moment into something meaningful. The older police officer stepped into frame, unable to resist adding his perspective. "You know, this young man has probably spent more hours on this track than anyone else in the past decade. He's not just training for himself, he's been mentoring kids here every weekend, showing them what dedication looks like." The reporter nodded, familiar with the story. "In fact, that's why we're here today. Your youth program has been making waves across the state. Other districts are looking to copy your model." She turned to address the camera directly, her professional instincts kicking in. "What we're witnessing here is actually a perfect example of why community connection matters." The woman shifted uncomfortably as more neighbors approached, many of them now realizing they were about to be part of a new story. Some were already sharing their own stories about the athlete, how he'd helped their kids with training, how he always made time to talk to young aspiring runners, how he'd never forgotten his roots despite his growing success. The camera captured it all: the early morning sun casting long shadows across the track, the gathered community members, the police cars with their lights still quietly flashing, and the perfect contrast of misunderstanding turned into connection. The reporter, sensing the educational potential of the moment, asked the athlete about his regular training routine. As he explained his dedication to both his Olympic dreams and community involvement, the woman found herself listening intently, her earlier suspicions replaced by growing admiration. "I come here every morning," the athlete explained to the camera, "because this track is where my dreams started. Every kid deserves a place where they can build their dreams." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. Sometimes it takes moments like this to remind us that we're all part of the same community story. The camera operator zoomed in on the woman's face as realization and regret played across her features. She stepped forward, interrupting the interview. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was just..." She trailed off, searching for words. "Being vigilant," the athlete suggested kindly. "That's not necessarily bad. But maybe we can channel that energy into building bridges instead of walls." The reporter's eyes lit up. This was the kind of sound bite that could transform a simple misunderstanding into a powerful lesson about community and understanding. The morning had grown warmer, and more students were arriving for weekend activities. They gathered at the edges of the crowd, whispering excitedly as they recognized the athlete from his visits to their classes. The camera panned across their eager faces, capturing the real impact of the athlete's presence in the community. What had started as a potential disaster was transforming, in real time and on camera, into a teaching moment about assumptions, community, and the power of open dialogue. The reporter knew she had something special, not just an interview about sports and success, but a story about human connection and growth. As the camera rolled, Capturing every moment, it became clear that this morning's events would reach far beyond their small community. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we plan to tell, but the ones that unfold unexpectedly before our eyes. The news van's satellite dish gleamed in the strengthening sunlight, ready to broadcast the story of misunderstanding turned to understanding, of conflict transformed into connection. And this was just the beginning, because sometimes the most important chapters of our story are the ones we never see coming. The local news segment aired that evening, but the story had already spread through social media like wildfire. By sunset, the video had thousands of shares, and the community's response was overwhelming. The school's phone lines lit up with calls from former students, teachers, and coaches, all eager to share their own stories about the athlete who had become much more than just a local sports star. The high school principal sat in his office, reading through hundreds of emails flooding his inbox. Many were from alumni who had trained alongside the athlete years ago. "He used to stay late after practice to help us with our form," one email read. Even back then, he was more focused on lifting others up than on his own success. In the teacher's lounge, veteran educators gathered around a laptop, watching the morning's news footage. The PE teacher, who had first noticed the athlete's potential a decade ago, wiped away tears as she watched her former student handle the situation with such grace. "That's exactly who he's always been," she told her colleagues, "always turning obstacles into opportunities." Local businesses began putting up signs of support in their windows. The coffee shop where the athlete often stopped after his morning runs created a special drink named after him, promising to donate the proceeds to youth sports programs. The owner remembered how the athlete would often buy extra coffees for students who couldn't afford them. At the community center, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. People wanted to know how they could get involved with the youth mentoring program. The center's director, overwhelmed by the response, started keeping a wait list. "This could have been just another negative story," she told her staff. "Instead, it's bringing people together in ways we never expected." Parents who had watched their children transform through the athlete's mentoring program began sharing their stories online. One mother posted about how her shy daughter had found her confidence through running. "He told her that every lap was a victory, no matter how fast or slow," she wrote. Now she's teaching other kids the same lesson. The local track club's membership applications surged. Young people from all backgrounds wanted to be part of what was happening. The club president, looking at the stack of new applications, remembered how the athlete had started a scholarship program 2 years ago, ensuring that any kid who wanted to run could have the chance. Former teammates from the athlete's high school days posted old photos and memories. Pictures of relay races, team celebrations, and quiet moments of encouragement flooded social media. Each image told a story of someone who had never forgotten where he came from, even as his own star rose. The school's current track team organized an impromptu gathering at the track. Students, parents, and community members brought flowers, cards, and handmade signs. But what touched people most was seeing the athlete still there, running his normal training routine, stopping to chat and encourage young runners just like any other day. The school board called an emergency meeting to discuss how to build on this moment. They reviewed proposals for expanded youth programs, community engagement initiatives, and ways to make school facilities more accessible to the neighborhood. The athlete's story had opened their eyes to possibilities they hadn't considered before. Local police officers shared stories about the athlete's work with their youth outreach program. "He doesn't just talk to kids about staying out of trouble," one officer wrote in a department memo. "He shows them how to channel their energy into something positive. That's worth more than any number of patrol cars on the street." The woman who had made the call that morning found her own perspective transforming as she read through the outpouring of community support. Her neighbors began stopping by, not to criticize, but to share their own stories about the community she had recently joined. Each conversation helped build bridges where walls had stood before. At the local diner, elderly residents who had lived in the neighborhood for decades shared memories of watching the athlete grow up. "Used to see him running to school every morning," one regular customer recalled. "Rain or shine, always with a wave and a smile. Some things never change." The high school's alumni association started a scholarship fund in the athlete's name, aimed at supporting students who showed the same spirit of community service. Within hours of the announcement, donations began pouring in from across the country. People who had never set foot in the town were moved by the story of transformation they had witnessed. As evening fell, the track where everything had started was quietly busy. Families walked the outer lanes together, talking about what they had learned. Young runners practiced their sprints, inspired by the day's events. The police officer who had responded that morning brought his own children to run a few laps, teaching them that every challenge could become a chance for growth. The story had touched something deep in people's hearts, not just because of what had happened, but because of how it had been transformed. In a world that often seemed divided, this small community had shown how understanding could grow from misunderstanding, and how one person's dedication to lifting others up could ripple out to touch countless lives. The floodlights came on as dusk settled, illuminating the track where it had all begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but something had shifted in the community's consciousness. They had been reminded that the strongest bonds often grow from moments of tension, when people choose to reach for understanding instead of turning away. A week after the incident, the police department's community room was packed beyond capacity. What normally hosted about 30 people for youth mentoring sessions now held over 100 eager faces. The athletes stood at the front, not as an Olympic hopeful, but as someone ready to share something more valuable than any medal. "I could have reacted differently that morning," he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "We all could have." He glanced at the woman who had called the police, now sitting in the front row. She had come at his personal invitation, turning what could have been a moment of shame into an opportunity for growth. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward to catch every word. Young kids sat cross-legged on the floor, their parents standing along the walls. Even a few police officers had switched their shifts to attend. The local news crew was back, but this time they stayed in the background, sensing that something special was unfolding. "When I was younger," the athlete continued, "my coach taught me something important. He said that the hardest race isn't against others, it's against our own assumptions." He paused, letting the words sink in. That morning on the track, we all had a chance to run that race. The woman raised her hand, surprising everyone. Her voice shook slightly as she stood up. "I want to share something too," she said. "I thought I was protecting my community, but I didn't even know what my community was." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of neighbors she had never really seen before. A young teenager in the back raised his hand. "But how do you stay calm when people judge you wrong?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of personal experience. The athlete nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. "That's a great question," he replied. "You know, when I'm running, there's this moment when everything burns, your lungs, your legs, your whole body is screaming to stop. But that's when champions are made, not by running faster, but by remembering why you started running in the first place." He walked into the crowd, making eye contact with different faces. "That morning, when I felt judged, I remembered why I come to that track every day. It's not just about me anymore. It's about every kid who needs to see that they belong, every person who needs to know their dreams matter." The local police chief stepped forward, adding his perspective. "What happened that morning could have gone viral for all the wrong reasons," he said. "Instead, it went viral because someone chose to build a bridge rather than a wall." Parents began sharing their own stories, times they had jumped to conclusions, moments they had missed chances to connect. The room buzzed with honest conversation, people opening up about fears and hopes they had never voiced before. The athlete pulled out some training equipment he had brought: jump ropes, resistance bands, simple things that anyone could use. "Sometimes the best way to understand each other is to work together," he said. "Who wants to learn some warm-up exercises?" What followed was unexpected and beautiful. People who had been strangers an hour ago were now partnering up, learning proper stretching techniques, laughing at their awkward attempts at athletic moves. The woman who had made the call found herself helping a young girl learn to jump rope properly. "See, that's good form," the athlete encouraged, moving through the groups. "Just like in running, life is about making adjustments, finding your rhythm." The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The session ran well over its scheduled time, but nobody seemed to mind. Parents exchanged phone numbers, kids made new friends, and officers shared stories about their own community experiences. The walls between us and them began to blur and fade. As the evening drew to a close, the athlete gathered everyone in a circle. "What happened that morning wasn't about me," he said. It was about us, all of us. Every day, we have a choice. We can see differences as threats, or we can see them as chances to learn something new. The woman who had made the call stood up again. I signed up to be a volunteer for the youth running program, she announced. The room erupted in applause, not just for her words, but for the courage it took to transform a mistake into a mission. As people began to leave, many lingered, not wanting the evening to end. The athlete stayed, answering questions, offering encouragement, being the same person he had always been, someone who saw every challenge as a chance to lift others up. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Cars pulled away from the parking lot, carrying people who had arrived as strangers but left as neighbors. The evening news would try to capture what had happened in the community room, but some things can't be fully translated through a camera lens. The real story was in the small moments, the handshakes that turned into hugs, the exchanged phone numbers, the promises to meet again. What had started as a confrontation on a quiet morning had transformed into something that would echo through the community for years to come. Because sometimes the greatest victories don't come with medals or trophies. They come in moments when people choose to open their hearts, to listen, to learn, and to grow together. 6 months after that fateful morning at the track, the story had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The athlete stood at a podium in a large conference center, facing an audience of educators, law enforcement officers, and community leaders from across the country. Behind him, a screen showed footage from that morning, but it wasn't the confrontation that played. It was what came after. "People keep asking me about that morning," he began, his voice carrying through the packed hall. "But the real story isn't about what happened on the track. It's about what happened in all the mornings that followed." The conference room was filled with people who had traveled from different states to learn about the community transformation that had begun with a simple misunderstanding. Among them sat the woman who had made the call, now a leading voice in the neighborhood's new community outreach program. Back in their hometown, the changes were visible everywhere. The high school track, once empty except for early morning training, now hosted regular community walking groups. Parents pushed strollers around the outer lanes, while others jogged on the inner track. The chain-link fence that had once seemed like a barrier now had a new sign: Community Track, All Welcome. The youth mentoring program had exploded from a small weekly gathering to a full-scale community initiative. What started with running had expanded to include homework help, career guidance, and family support services. The police department had become a partner, not just in maintaining order, but in building connections. Our waiting list kept growing, the community center director told a reporter. "So we started training more mentors. Now we have doctors, teachers, business owners, all volunteering their time. It's not just about sports anymore. It's about showing kids that their community believes in them." The local news crew that had captured the original incident had stuck with the story, documenting the changes. Their latest piece showed the athlete training alongside kids from all backgrounds, while parents and neighbors chatted on the bleachers. The track had become more than a place for running. It was where the community came together. In an unexpected turn, the incident had sparked a nationwide conversation about community policing. The older officer who had responded that morning now led workshops teaching other departments how to turn potential conflicts into opportunities for connection. His presentations always started with the same message: sometimes the best policing happens when we put down our notepads and pick up our humanity. The woman's transformation had been particularly powerful. From someone who once called the police on a stranger, she had become an advocate for community understanding. Her story of change resonated with people who saw themselves in her journey from fear to friendship. "I used to think I was protecting my neighborhood," she told the conference audience. "Now I understand that real protection comes from knowing your neighbors, not suspecting them." Her words were met with nods of recognition from people who had faced similar realizations in their own communities. The athlete's Olympic training continued, but it had taken on new meaning. Each morning, as he ran his laps, others joined him, some to train, some to walk, some just to be part of something bigger than themselves. The track had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over division. Local businesses had caught the spirit of change. The coffee shop near the track now hosted monthly community meetings. The owner had replaced the security cameras with a wall of photos showing neighborhood events and celebrations. We realized we didn't need to watch for trouble, he said. We needed to watch out for each other. The school board had taken notice too. They implemented new policies making school facilities more accessible to the community after hours. Other schools in the district began copying the model, turning their tracks and fields into gathering spaces where neighbors could meet and connect. The athlete's story had been featured in national magazines, but not for his athletic achievements. Instead, they focused on how one morning of potential conflict had sparked a movement of understanding. Conference invitations poured in from around the country, each asking him to share the secret of turning confrontation into conversation. But perhaps the most profound change was visible in the small, daily interactions. The morning dog walkers who used to hurry past now stopped to chat. The elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades found themselves hosting weekly coffee meetings for new residents. Children played freely on the school grounds, supervised not by security cameras, but by a community of caring adults. As the athlete concluded his conference speech, he shared a final thought. People ask me about my biggest victory. They expect me to talk about races or medals. But my biggest victory happens every morning when I see people from all walks of life sharing the same track where our story began. Because in the end, it's not about running away from our differences, it's about running toward understanding. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but the athlete's mind was already on tomorrow morning's training session. Because he knew that while his story had traveled far, the real work happened in those quiet moments just after sunrise, when neighbors came together on a track that had taught them all how to see each other as simply fellow travelers on life's journey.